Hello, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube, and welcome to Fanalysis, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I'm Retty4, this is GreyJedi91.
Hey guys.
This is Evan Nova95.
Hello.
And this is Antoine Bandelet.
I solemnly swear I'm up to no good.
Give us a little introduction to set the stage for this, Matt.
Okay, so this is book 1, chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. And rather than take you through like a summary of the chapter, because that's what we're about to do very in depth, I'll just say that it's the chapter that sort of sets the stage and like puts like our players sort of in motion. We're kind of setting up our chessboard here. And it's the establishing chapter. And it starts from a very different perspective than will be the case normally. It starts from Uncle Dursley. Or Uncle Vernon, Uncle Dursley.
Very exciting way to start off an epic about sorcery. It's about a dude going to work at a drilling company.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, here, I might be biased because of the way I first got introduced to the story was because I saw the movie first. So I don't think I ever had that issue of being like, this opening chapter's so boring. And oh my God, he's going to like the drill. I actually was very impressed by just the voice she had in the writing side, because it's my first time actually being introduced to like the voice of J.K. Rowling, and it's very, very apparent from the first paragraph, especially like the use of "thank you very much." It's like, whoa, what you can say that in a book? Like you can like kind of like break the fourth wall a little bit in that way, and it felt more like I could hear someone speaking to me while reading this book, and I could do that throughout the entire series. Versus some other books where it just feels like, yeah, this is definitely just on the page. It's kind of just dry, but it always has something going on.
It kind of has like that campfire effect where it's like you could like all sit down at a fire and have someone read it to you, and it feels all very personal.
It's very Roald Dahl in the initial approach for this book, which is interesting and effective because it's not how she writes in general. It's specific to this chapter and occasionally comes up again later on in different parts of the earlier books. But it's because it's looking back on it, because it's so different to how she usually writes and her usual style. It's interesting to see how effective she is with this, despite it being kind of alien to her overall nature with it. Because it like you say, with the our story starts in reference to the weather and stuff, and the perfectly normal "thank you very much" scene. She doesn't do that elsewhere, so it's kind of
It feels like the narrator or whatever, the omniscient narrator, has like a distinctive voice where that kind of vanishes later on, but it's replaced with one that I think sort of subconsciously just mirrors Harry's impressions. Like a lot of like there's a lot of inherent confusion or humor or whatever that seems more in line with Harry's personality as we move throughout the books.
Yeah, she kind of adds that layer of perspective to the writing itself, but because she doesn't have the main character yet, she's using her own kind of narrative style, and it works well because obviously this is the first book of a children's series. It's an excellent introduction for the kind of young reader who doesn't understand a lot of the terms that we use later on and a lot of the kind of narrative constructs. This just is a nice, simple way, very simple way to get the personalities and like you said, set the stage and put all the players in motion. A really simple way of doing it.
And one of my favorite opening lines is just the way she initially describes Mrs. Dursley, like, saying that it seems as if her neck was built to spy on her neighbors. You know what I mean? Like she's built for that very purpose. Like she was built to be a suburban housewife, in the truest sense of those words. And she just does it so well. And it's also I would say whimsical. I feel like these opening paragraphs and chapters, and I feel that her voice does maintain itself. Like I think it's definitely more heavy-handed in this first chapter, but it's definitely still present in the way she writes going forward.
Absolutely, it just changes in tone and sort of presentation. That's all. It's not the character perspective as heavy on the character perspective and drawing attention to it later on, because we're seeing it all through the same lens of Harry rather than a shifting one. That has to be redefined each time.
And what's great though is it could make that transition without like being jarring. It's not like distracting as you move on through the book when the perspective changes.
And not to be skipping way ahead, but even the thing that Antoine mentioned specifically about Petunia, like the way she's built, like as if she's like a spy or whatever, that's totally like her character motivation and like going back to when she was a kid. So it's like it instantly establishes like a trait that is like through and through with her. That's important.
And Rowling does a good job of contrast too. You know what I mean? Because you have like stout Dursley, or I'm sorry, Mr. Dursley, and you have Ms. Dursley, who's like very tall and blonde and stuff like that. So it's like I like that she does that. She does that a lot in the book too. I mean, it helps with I think middle grade and young adult fiction in that way.
Yeah, there are a lot of examples in the early chapters, 2 and 3 in particular, where and the end of this one as well, where she'll give about 3 sentences of description in almost a silly way. Hagrid comes to mind with the dustbin hands and the baby dolphin feet. But they so quickly and summates the descriptions to the point where you'll read 3 lines and you'll have that character set in your head perfectly. It's really well done and very effective, particularly for the young readers, like you say, people who don't have the kind of maybe not at the attention span to read like an entire paragraph of establishment for just the visual.
Yeah, and it's her first book too, which is crazy.
And can I just say that
first chapter of the first book, no less.
It was maybe a little too good at that, like for me, like when I was younger, because I'm going, these people don't like imagination, and like this guy's grumpy and he's going to work, and it's like when I tried reading this as like a 7-year-old, I go, I don't like this story.
I don't like him. I'm not watching. I'm not reading.
Yeah, I'm like, what is this? So I mean, it worked almost too effectively for me, I will say.
Yeah, she was definitely trying. She was trying very hard to set up the tone and the kind of establishing fact that the Dursleys are as mundane as possible. This is a mundane family in a mundane setting, and there's nothing interesting or strange happens with these people. Thank you very much. So it because of the way she was trying to tell that, make that point, it affects how the characters are presented. Because these are almost cartoonish in presentation. In the early books, later on they kind of she reels it in as the tone begins to shift again and focus more on the dramatic and the tense side. We know, as you said about Petunia being almost spy-like, we know that she and Vernon have a lot of secrets that are being kind of advertised here in the first chapter, but you don't, as a first-time reader or even as a young child, necessarily click the significance of their fear of the magic itself. You just think they don't like anything, they don't like anything strange or unusual. It's not because they are terrified of the actual magic they know exists bleeding into their present reality.
Yeah, we come to find out it's just like they have no ability to comprehend any of that. But I mean, it's just the idea they don't want to be associated with it is enough for them. And it's a nice way of sort of introducing those little kernels of mysteries, because he just doesn't like thinking about it. So even though he alludes to it, from his perspective, he doesn't go in depth even in his own thoughts.
That's the key, I think, with her narrative style.
Denial.
Her kind of discussion in her voice, as Antoine says, in the book is always completely married to the perspective of the person she's wielding at the time, with that almost always being Harry, of course. We have like an understandable reason for why certain things like get cut off. If Harry's attention shifts to something else, we don't need this kind of long-winded introspective discussion about this subject because Harry's not thinking it.
He won't do it that way.
Yeah. She's always, which is particularly interesting in book 5, but we'll get there. She won't she's writing the third person, but she's always layering it through the character's perspective, and that's not something that everyone does. And I think that kind of being her core spine of her style is what makes this first chapter so kind of not jarring, but looking back on it from the future, odd to us, because it's so Roald Dahlish compared to her usual style.
Yeah, even though she has the third person limited going on, you definitely still get her own like opinions about these characters like seeping through. But it still works though. Like it's not like totally like I don't know. I was really captured by her. Like I always like, even in interviews, like when she speaks stuff like that, I like that's the same person. I'm like, oh yeah, that's totally the same person who wrote this book, kind of a situation, versus being like a completely different entity entirely.
She very clearly has a natural passion for the material she's making. She can close her eyes and put herself in the world as much as any of us, which is actually a rare thing for creators, even authors.
Yeah, that is so hard.
Indeed,
it's so hard. And like we were saying before, how she encapsulates Hagrid in a sentence or two.
Yeah,
like brevity is very, very hard for a writer to achieve. Like that's why sometimes you get very long prose, paragraphs about this place. It's like you can do it very shortly, and then you get it like starkly in your mind, and then you can move on, which usually are like the best sellers because they're page turners and very easy to read. Like you were saying earlier off the podcast, like rereading it for you was just is a joy, and for me too. Like rereading this entire the first 3 chapters was just like it was felt like home.
That's what I was about to say. It feels like coming home. She herself, Rowling, has said that I hope Hogwarts is always there to welcome you home, or it will always be there to welcome you home. And it's a powerful statement because it is so true for everyone. You know, picking up these books, this book that I read through again for the Fanalysis that we're doing, is the same book I've read when I was 5. It's the same book I've picked up literally hundreds of times throughout my life and just gone through. And you said yourself, in episode 0, you've read it in one sitting at the very start. Which is, I did for the later books as well.
Insane for like a 10-year-old.
Every book past the second, because I was too young beforehand, I just read in one sitting, just gone straight through it. And that is so rare. And the fact that it's for so many people as well. It's not just us, the nerds.
Right.
My mother has done the same thing, and she's not a fantasy buff.
It's like we mentioned, this book has such a wide range of appeal due to the just way it's written alone.
And that's the thing. It's the fact that it's not the subject, it's not the characters by themselves. It's the actual way she's written it. The flow of paragraph to paragraph, and the kind of it's not just the pacing, but the narrative prose of it. It comes down as well largely to the fact that she can get so much information across in such a short span of time, oftentimes without you even realizing it.
For me, it's very balanced between the two. Between here's the plot and here's the character and here's what they're up to, but here's also like taking a time to just live in their shoes and breathe like their air for a minute, and you view the world through their eyes without being boring and tangential and taking forever about that stuff. It's very well balanced in that way. And also you guys mentioned how quickly she can sort of get to the essence of what makes that character a character through her description of them. I think that it's worth noting that if you listen to at least the American editions of the audiobooks, those characters sound like the actors do, even though they were produced before those movies existed. Like when he's doing McGonagall's voice, it sounds like McGonagall, like before she was cast. It sounds like Hagrid before he was cast. So it's like she's done that good of a job that I think we all kind of have the same idea of these characters in our hearts and in minds and everything, which is really unusual.
Right.
Very impressive to be able to define the characters in such a short space of time. I mean, even at the end of book 1, everyone is visualizing Hogwarts pretty much the same way on like the effect of when I say the word unicorn, everyone pictures exactly the same thing. If I say the word Hagrid, it's the same thing. That is a powerful example of how effective her writing style is.
Snape's goatee notwithstanding.
Right.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
A little cool thing too, in the to behind the scenes note, is that in terms of Mr. Dursley, he goes out about his day. He's trying to think about drills, but he sees all these people walking, on the streets with these emerald and purple clothing.
Emerald cloaks. Yeah.
Yeah, and apparently behind the scenes that is actually a deliberate thing. So what wizards do when they are out in the Muggle world and they wanted to know each other is that they'll often wear emerald and purple, so that if they're in a Muggle cafe, they're like, oh, that's a wizard over there. What's up? So they can identify one another. So I thought that was pretty cool too, that sort of thing she puts in there, even though she doesn't overtly explain that. It's like, if you want to find that information, you can find it, but it's just something that she'll insert there as a Easter egg.
And also that makes sense because those are two of the least worn colours in general fashion, or at least back then anyway. It makes sense and is also practical. I like it.
Especially if people are just wearing black and gray suits in the district that
absolutely.
Dursley probably works out.
Okay, so it's funny you mentioned that because I remember that when I first read this, I wasn't picturing it in the more modern era. To me, I was 7 years old and everything English to me was Dickensian. It was Charles Dickens and Victorian and grey and dingy and horrible. And I also didn't realize that's kind of a trope to have a British orphan raised by horrible step parents. So there were all these things. I was picturing this in olden times, but it's funny that you guys weren't. You guys were just picturing modern day.
Yeah, it's one of the things I wanted to mention actually, because when we talked about starting this Fanalysis and I kind of glanced over the book series in my mind again, it occurred to me for the first time really that because obviously you're all American, you have no visual equivalent of what Privet Drive is for me. Even as a 5-year-old, when it was just given a light description of the kind of borough, I immediately knew what it was she was talking about. But obviously you've got the suburban equivalent. But what were you guys visualizing? I'm not counting London because that's a bit more.
Palmdale, California for the suburban of Privet Drive. Now, if you don't live in near Southern California, you have no idea what Palmdale means. It sounds like Privet Drive. But if you know Palmdale, you know Palmdale.
Yeah, it's quite the place.
So bright, sunny, light pavements.
All the houses look the same.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So that's what I was expecting. It's amusing to me because obviously that's what most people do. They'll draw on the references they have from nearby and slap that visual on. Until the films come along, they have no kind of clear central view of it. It was interesting that hadn't occurred to me before. Until obviously you get to Hogwarts, because everyone knows what Hogwarts looks like.
and then so we're kind of shifting into like the cat.
Yeah, the cat they've seen previously, or Uncle Vernon had seen previously.
So he was like, "Is he reading that sign?"
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's like, no, he's looking at it.
Cat can't read signs. No, it's a map, not a sign.
Well, map to start with, and then the sign afterwards,
which is another awesome example of her using third-person limited perspective, but then still having the voice of Dursley within the prose. Not like it wasn't a self-thought that he had about that. It was literally just in the prose that she wrote that, which is like, again, so masterful.
She is a genius when it comes to that technique, and it's really rare. Most people will go one or the other. They will not blend the two, and if they do, they usually do it inconsistently, which she doesn't. It's really, really well written in that regard. But I also like the fact that the first magical entity or person we see in the entire series is McGonagall. I appreciate that as a McGonagall fan. We don't know it, of course. The first person we know is a magical entity is Dumbledore as he apparates into the street, or the drive, I should say. But McGonagall is obviously the one we see first, technically, and I like that little tabby cat with the square markings.
So in the sequence, we're also introduced to the deluminator, great device which he uses to put out all the street lamps.
Yeah, the put outer.
It's kind of our first like little. It's interesting how that's like our first introduction to like a quote unquote like magical tool. Like it's not a wand, it's his little device. I don't know. It's just an interesting little detail.
Interesting as well because they're not that common. Actual enchanted devices are usually kind of left in the background of the story. This is definitely one of the iconic exceptions to that rule. Also, it's called the put outer.
It's interesting that that's like the first example we get. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so obviously iconic as a result. Just a note, I always called it the putter outer instead of the put outer because I just read it as that the first time and didn't realize because it never came up again. I was harboring that illusion for too many years.
I had issues as a child sometimes distinguishing the magical nonsense that she's making up from stuff that actually exists. And I would go to my parents and be like, what is this? What's a put outer? What's a delimit? And they're like, I don't know. Because they didn't know because it's magic nonsense. So it really took me like until the movies that I could really, that's all it was? It was like a thing that just sucked up the lights. Okay. I really had a hard time picturing this world at first. It's ironic because it went on to become one of my favorite, series of all time, but still.
Yeah, the early days of Matt with Harry Potter. It's interesting actually that the film provided such a kind of opening lens for so many people in that regard because with other franchises and series, oftentimes the book will be the one that does that rather than the film opening the visuals because of the fact that the film so perfectly kind of adapted the book and basically just followed it beat for beat with rare exception. It gave you that kind of... You could almost read from book 2 and never have read book 1 if you just watched the film. And I think that kind of helped set the scene and characters a lot by having that be so true to it.
Except when it comes to Peeves. You'd be like, who's Peeves?
Except Peeves, yeah. We'll have that conversation.
Also, we had our first alliteration name, the Daedalus Dickle or whatever, the guy they're like, the shooting stars guy. They're like, because McGonagall, she's saying like, all these people are being ridiculous, with our secrecy laws, and like they're just going out even with muggles and stuff like that. And they talk about the Kent shooting stars or whatever. And then we have like, she loves doing this like alliteration stuff with people's names or like titles of books and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, Minerva McGonagall herself is the perfect example of that. And yeah, I like the idea that he was once, a difficult student she had back in the day, and I bet it was a Daedalus Diggle. He always was a bit of a prat. I like that kind of, which gets to my next point about her. She's a perfect example of one of those characters that was perfectly kind of Rowling perfectly encapsulated the essence of who she is in the earliest appearance, because this all the different kind of parts of this scene that kind of give you different sides of McGonagall's character hold true to what we see for the rest of the series. She's always establishing that key baseline in the early introductions that hold true throughout.
That's true, because usually you don't get like the dynamic of a person until like later on in the story. But even here, just in this one scene, you see that she's both sharp but also compassionate, where she's talking about how are we going to leave this boy with these terrible people who I've been watching all day, but at the same time going around and being like, why are you like having Harry do this job? I bet you it was like, Diggle who did all that, so you see that she's this dynamic and fully realized person, not just this one note, character that we often get.
Which is also, like you mentioned, contrast earlier in sort of a visual sense. This is more like contrast in terms of just like, I don't know, personality, because like the Dursleys have been like these horrible, boring, just unimaginative, whatever people, just mundanity, being their trait. And she's not exactly fun-loving at all. But again, like you said, there's a warm side to it. There's like there's a human quality to it that differentiates her.
There's a gradient as well with it, because she's, like you said, she's the stiff upper lip type. We see that when Hagrid arrives and she goes back into she kind of puts the mask back on because she's not as comfortable with him as she is with Albus. But the fact that she is so vehemently just kind of shocked by the idea that they're going to leave Harry with these people, he's like, you can't, it's like, that's ridiculous, don't do that. No, she's not outraged obviously, but she's passionate in her defense, and she has no reason to besides the fact that she cares, because this is just the kid of one of her or a pair of her old students. She's not family or anything, she's just that kind of teacher role attachment.
And as we come to figure out, she has a little soft spot for Harry too. I mean, she was the one who got him the Nimbus, correct?
Yeah,
2001.
Yeah, the Nimbus.
Yeah, she got him the Nimbus. Yeah,
which is not exactly cheap.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying. Like, she has a soft spot. I mean, she usually doesn't reserve that for most of her students. She's very, sharp and shrewd, when she's teaching. But she has a soft spot for him.
The fact that he's allowed on the Quidditch team against all the rules anyway is like a big favor from her.
He thinks he's going to be expelled and everything.
Yeah, and largely because of her own passion for Quidditch. It's another. We'll get that more specifically later on. That's not the scene, but it's
everybody's a fully realized person. It's cool. Like, they all have their own personal interests.
She always, not always, but she often kind of manufactures their introduction to have some sort of impetus attached to it that lets her define that. There'll always be something or some context given that allows her to give the initial introduction a sense of depth and a thorough understanding of the character for Harry. Usually, obviously, and it's an exception here, but for Harry as he meets them, she doesn't just say, "Oh, and he met this person, and then this happens." It always has like he's meeting this person for this reason or in this context, which allows their personality to shine through if it's their first appearance anyway, and oftentimes when it's not.
And to add another layer to her, like, even though we can kind of surmise that she's someone you don't cross and that she's a very strong individual, when it comes up to the Voldemort sequence about saying who versus Voldemort, she too is like, no, I'm kind of uncomfortable saying that name. And then for us as a reader, we're like, what's okay, Voldemort, like, or Voldemort, like, could you guys even pronounce it like
nope
the first time?
Not really.
What is that V name?
I mentioned it. It was like, it's that word again. Indeed. Like in my head, it was like a blank. It was the V word, whatever. Like, I don't know, whatever that word. It's there again.
That was one of the ones I got instantly as Voldemort without problems. But I later found out that it actually is supposed to be Voldemort.
Voldemort.
Even by Rowling's own,
which no one says.
Discussion. Yeah, no one says that. Obviously, the films help drive the misconception home. But I personally prefer Voldemort as the term. Voldemort sounds more
defined.
Yeah, it's more curt, it's more solid. It's there.
Voldemort sounds a little bit beautiful, actually.
Yeah, precisely. It's too elegant.
Voldemort's a lot sharper, with that extra sound,
it's the sharpness that gets it. It's too elegant with Voldemort. You don't want elegance attached to him. You want, rough, rugged, mort, death.
Too elegant or too French?
One and the same. Pretty much everything. France is basically married to
France.
language.
Sorry, France. But
it's also cool because we also establish, where the power dynamics are, who fears who. We respect Dumbledore a bit because we're like, oh, he's okay with saying, this thing, even though we don't fully understand the weight of it quite yet. We're still like, oh, okay, Dumbledore, you're the guy basically in this. You're the Merlin in this, basically.
Yes, that's a key thing. He's very clearly the Merlin of the story. Even in design aesthetic, this is someone who is he is the archetypal character that draws from the archetype of Merlin, for sure. I also noticed as well that McGonagall refers to him she does say Albus occasionally, but mostly as Dumbledore, which I think is more a case of her wanting to define the name because it's the first time the reader is introduced to the character, more than her personal choice, because she's almost always referring to him as Albus outside of this. because obviously they're quite personally.
Right. They're more peers than anything.
Yeah. It was worth noting, I think, that she's making a point of trying to get us familiarised with the names, which again is another example of Dumbledore. It's a ridiculous name. It sounds as silly as it is, but you don't think
That's
so.
J.K. Rowling, man.
Yeah.
She makes the ridiculous sound.
But you don't care.
amazing.
You just buy it immediately because of how it's
Yeah.
presented through the kind of lens of the characters. It's really, really impressive writing.
Yeah, and again, like just how these characters have sort of permeated everything. I could say to my grandmother Dumbledore, and she knows what I'm talking about.
Yes,
It crosses all age boundaries. But talking about names, it's interesting, like just how many are kind of dropped, in like these early chapters of the book. I mean, it's a little early because we haven't actually covered Hagrid, but like, well, do we want to get to that?
Yeah,
we're in
let's
Hagrid.
move
Yeah,
to
you do
let's move
that.
to Hagrid, yeah.
That's
Don't
fine.
worry.
So Hagrid shows up on Sirius Black Spike,
Yeah,
which
I
the
got it
first-
from Young Sirius, and it's like
Yeah.
just a simple name drop, and you're like,
I don't remember.
I'm sure that name will have no significance later down the line.
But it's like I don't remember reading that name the first time I read this, so I clearly did flush it down like my mental toilet. Like whatever, he's got a flying bike he got from some nobody, and like little do I know who Sirius Black is nobody.
Was Dumbledore aware that Sirius was supposed to have the what was it? The protection.
A Delius charm.
Yeah. What did he? Was he aware of it at that point?
He was, because he tried to talk them out of it, I think.
He
Or he
testified.
questioned the idea anyway.
He mentioned that he testified that Sirius had been the secret keeper. Like that's what they call it. Like when you have that put upon you. Like he didn't realize. I don't think.
That it was
I get
like last minute.
Yeah, I think he advised against it, but they did it anyway.
Well, he wanted it
so
to be
he didn't
him.
know.
He offered it himself, didn't he?
Oh man, dude, with Dumbledore,
would
you
have been,
saved
which
life,
would have
man.
been, which would have been probably the wiser choice. Given it's Dumbledore.
Yeah, why wouldn't you do that? That's ridiculous.
Well, I mean, also, and
trusting
then
the
also it was Neville and Harry that were like they didn't really know
that's
who
true.
he was gonna go for, so.
Yeah.
So it's hard to like, put it on me. I'll save the Potter boy, but not the Longbottom boy.
The other thing that's
Yeah,
interesting is
that's
at this
Bummer.
point, at this point in the story, no one is aware of the fact that the whole Sirius Wormtail thing is happening. Pretty much as this scene is happening.
It's happening right now. Yeah.
It's off there, and no one's kind of alluding to it because no one's aware. It's interesting that this is the scene where prior to that everything else comes afterwards, but you never even know until the book 3. There's so much going on, and I imagine she had that even in her head at this point, having mentioned.
I know
Sirius
she had
Black.
all 7
She
books
had to have,
outlined.
yeah.
She had the last chapter written before she started on the first book. So I mean, she says things changed and stuff like that, of course.
She clearly like left out some details,
Right.
But in terms of like the structure, like she planned that out. Like you don't, it would just, and that's what I love about her writing, just the way that she does plan it out, like in a way that it becomes so clear upon repeat. It's one of the few series I love to revisit for that reason. You're always, every time I reread it, there's a connection you're making that you didn't notice before.
Yeah. There's a particular moment in the Potions Master chapter we'll get to later that defines that on a ridiculous level. But we'll get to that when we get there. But Hagrid turns up. We have the wonderful introduction of him, wild, too big to be allowed. I love that description. Dustbin hands, etc. I like the
Makes the bike look tiny.
Yeah. It's kind of because when you now have 3 stable characters together, it's a good time to talk about it. The other thing that she does amazingly with her writing is the kind of the attachment of dialogue to the scenes. Her narrative prose and flow isn't attached solely to her kind of written descriptions of things. It's and the flow of the actual narration. It's also the dialogue of the characters. They are having conversations that absolutely define their voices. As you said before, Antoine, the characters' voices are here Matt, not Antoine. Here exactly as you imagine them to be, and they will always be the same. They never. No one has the problem of samey voice that so many other authors have, where every character sounds the same. They all have their own distinct tics.
Hagrid's probably the most distinctive because she literally like drops letters off to make it sound like he's saying Harry instead of Harry. He can only sound that way. Like she made it so that you can't interpret it any other way.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's carrying through for Dumbledore and McGonagall. McGonagall's kind of severity, Dumbledore's clipped sentences where he's delivering only as much information as he's willing to give. Because even in this scene, he's being very shrewd. He's got a lot of cards off the table. He's not telling anyone. He's like, we may never know. We can only guess, and he knows exactly what happened. understand at this point.
Well,
to an
yeah.
extent.
yeah, he knows to an extent. Yeah, he is guessing, but like he says, like later on, like his guesses are always right because he's Dumbledore.
Yeah, I mean, he's quite good.
I guess a lot, but
yeah.
I'm good guessing.
But I love McGonagall's reaction to Hagrid as well. Before he arrived, are you sure we can trust him with something as important as this? It's like his heart's in the right place, but you can't deny he's careless. She's got that concerned kind of again, severe nature where she cares, and that's why she's criticizing it. She's not got anything against Hagrid, but it's just maybe not entrust the child to him, and then it's Dumbledore's reaction, which is wonderful.
It's also well, that reaction, that's Dumbledore, like through and through, like he trusts people. Like it's not just Hagrid, it's also questionable people like Snape and so on. As we find out.
The powerful line though, just I trust Hagrid with my life.
And that's what I think. That's sort of like what I think makes Dumbledore sort of heroic and inspirational, is that he does do that. Like he has that ability to forgive, like whatever else you've done. Like he still can put trust in you.
He puts faith in people, and that's, I think, what helped him to like distance himself from like Grindelwald and like what he was getting into when he was younger. Is that he started like not just thinking, okay, I will be the guy, I will take over. He's like, no, I have to trust and delegate out to others in this world, to be kind of a decent human being. So yeah,
I also
love.
I also think it's sort of a Gryffindor thing. Like it's like one of those core differences between like if you're able to put that much of your faith in somebody else, whereas somebody like Voldemort, that's like an alien thought. What are you talking about?
Do it all myself. What? And even Dumbledore, like he does a really good job often of dissuading people. Like when McGonagall says, like, can you take care of his scar? Like what's going on with that? Really, obviously for him, he knows he needs to kind of keep that because that's like his protection against Voldemort. But then also, he's like, to not get into that situation, he just like dissuades it by like, oh, scars are wonderful. I have one like above my knee that looks like the Underground of London.
Layers on the eccentricity.
Plays off as a joke.
Play around it. Question: do we think he was telling the truth? Does he actually have a scar of the?
He probably has something similar to it.
Maybe. I mean, they never really like deny it or confirm it, so it could be.
Every time he says something like that, it could be like him just joking around, but it always pans out that he wasn't. Like I'm thinking of a thing from book 4 right now. Yep. But
I
you
found
could probably
that wonderful room.
Yeah.
Happened to be hundreds of.
Well, and also with the mirror of Eris said too. Like he, it says he had wool socks or something. Like
that one was a lie though.
That one's a complete lie.
Yeah.
So I was saying, like, it can go
Tragic
both
lie.
ways. Yeah.
But that leads us on to the sad scene of the three, because again, as I said before, we get the whole layered reactions from the characters, so we can get across the strong personalities of these people, particularly because they're mainstays of the series. She knew that these guys were going to be important throughout and wanted to find them more than the occasional side character that maybe gets a bit less. We've got the concern from McGonagall, the reaction to Hagrid, the switch to Hagrid as chiding him for being loud because they need to be secret, they can't let the Muggles see them, etc. And then we go into the more important thing, which is each of their reaction to leaving Harry behind.
And the gravity of the situation.
Yeah, and it's that's the word I would use, because it's establishing that this is a powerful moment and a kind of important moment for the story. It's not just a case of this is set up for the character. We've got to get the main character into the right place. No, this is a not iconic moment, but it's a dramatic scene that will. It's always, important. Yeah, it will. Yeah, it's just important. It will carry importance throughout the story, and I love the fact that they layer that with the personal reaction of the characters, with the sobbing Hagrid, the kind of fast blinking McGonagall because she's not willing to lower her guard with Hagrid there, and Dumbledore's just that twinkle in his eye that just goes out for a bit.
And setting up also how special Harry is, because we're like they said that he's going to be the most famous child ever in our history, and what we're going to get in the following chapters is that he is treated like dirt, the complete opposite of what he should be treated as within his life.
And with Dumbledore and McGonagall both speaking to that, he's like, he'll have a horrible life here, and and he'll there's no child that won't know his name in our world. And Dumbledore's like, no, this is important. That's a terrible thing for a child. And it's true. It's true. He's right. Harry is as we'll talk about.
He could become a Draco if he grew up.
He grows up very, very well as a result.
He grew up entitled.
But it's also.
Or he might grow up like his dad, actually. Or he might have the least favored attributes of his father if he grew up in that kind of environment.
But even as you say that, really there's a lot of commonality between James and Draco, of all things.
For sure.
So both
And
apply.
we'll get to that for sure.
And also,
both
all three of
comparisons
these people
fit.
know that as well. That's another thing that because of the generational gaps of these both all being teachers in Hogwarts, there's all of the elder, or at least most of the elder characters that we know knew the previous generation, which is it's interesting how that kind of plays off their perspectives and the characters' reaction to their perspectives when they become known in the story. McGonagall and Sirius being the prime example.
One sequence I like a lot, just so I can read it off, is just that I think it's just done really well, just in terms of writing and what it means for the final paragraph. But one small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing that he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. Like that, like she does. This is just her.
Yeah.
She just does it throughout the entire book, and you're like, how do you make this sound so perfect?
It's just the flow. Every sentence
Yeah.
flows. Like the length of this
Smooth.
sentence will balance out with the shortness of the next sentence, which will have a little bit of prose attached to it, which will have an excess of description. Everything just flows like a tide with her writing, and I've never seen it since in anything. Nothing has even come close to
neither
being as
have I.
easy to read for that. It's a true like
Not
specialty,
on
I
a
think.
commercial level too. It's just once in a lifetime type thing.
Indeed.
But any final thoughts, you guys, that you guys wanted to speak on that didn't get covered before we end our first episode?
Not sure. I think everything was covered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much
Yeah,
everything.
it was the
we
it was the
needed
chapter.
to.
Yeah, it was the
Ex-
chapter
ex-
that alienated me when I was a kid, but I enjoy it now looking back.
A solid introduction.
Mhm.
I was just pleased by the fact that it didn't ring as wrong to me from the fact that we know everything that comes forward. You know, it felt like, as you said, Antoine, felt like coming home. Which is all I can ask for with Harry Potter series. But
So
yeah,
that
that's
is
us wrapped
it.
up.
We'll see you guys on the
That's
next
that.
one.
Pretty much everything.
I'm ready
Yeah.
forward. I still don't have an outro.
Liar. Grey Jedi 91. Take care.
Evan Nova 95. We hope you guys enjoyed. We'll see you guys later.
Antoine Bandelet, Mischief Managed.
Goodbye.